In the early hours of June 6, 1944, long before the first landing craft opened their steel ramps onto the beaches of Normandy, and long before the thunder of artillery rolled across the coastline, a handful of soldiers were already moving silently toward a mission that would determine the fate of the entire invasion. While the world would later remember the beaches Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword as the iconic symbols of the Allied return to Europe, the first decisive blow of that day would occur miles inland, in the darkness, beside a quiet canal crossed by a narrow steel bridge. That bridge, later known to history as Pegasus Bridge, held an importance far greater than its modest appearance suggested. If German forces managed to control or destroy it, armored divisions could move quickly against the eastern flank of the invasion beaches, potentially pushing the Allies back into the sea before they could establish a foothold in France. But if the bridge were captured intact, it would secure the eastern flank of the Allied landings and prevent German counterattacks from crossing the canal toward the vulnerable landing forces approaching Sword Beach. The responsibility for this mission was given to a carefully selected group of soldiers from the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry under the command of Major John Howard. Their task was simple in theory, but incredibly dangerous in execution. Land directly beside the bridge in the middle of the night, overwhelm the German guards before they could react, and secure the structure before explosives could be detonated. The attack would not come from the ground or from the sea. Instead, the soldiers would arrive in wooden gliders, silent aircraft without engines that would be towed across the English Channel before being released to glide down toward their target in the darkness. It was a plan that demanded extraordinary precision. A mistake of only a few hundred meters could scatter the attackers across the countryside and doom the mission before it even began. For weeks before the invasion, the men assigned to this operation trained relentlessly in the English countryside. Major Howard was known for his strict discipline and careful attention to detail. Every step of the assault was practiced repeatedly until the movements became instinctive. The soldiers rehearsed night assaults, rapid exits from gliders, and the capture of bridges built to replicate the one they would face in France. They practiced attacking from both ends, securing defensive positions, and searching for demolition charges that the Germans might have placed along the bridge's structure. The training was intense, sometimes exhausting, but every man understood the reason behind it. They were preparing for an operation in which success would be measured, not in hours, but in minutes. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, German forces continued their occupation of Normandy. The German High Command knew an invasion was coming, eventually, but they remained uncertain about where it would happen. Many believed the main assault would occur further north near Pas-de-Calais, where the channel was narrower. Allied deception operations reinforced this belief, creating the illusion of an enormous invasion force waiting to strike in that region. As a result, some areas of Normandy were less heavily fortified than they might otherwise have been, and the defenders stationed near the canal east of Caen were not fully prepared for the kind of precise airborne assault that was about to take place. On the night of June 5, 1944, the men of the British Airborne Forces began moving toward their aircraft. Among them were the soldiers chosen to capture the bridges near the village of Benoîtville. The gliders they would use were the Airspeed Horsa, large wooden aircraft capable of carrying several dozen troops along with their weapons and equipment. Unlike conventional airplanes, these gliders had no engines. They would be towed into the air by larger aircraft and then released near the target area, gliding silently to the ground. Inside the gliders, the soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder in the narrow interior. Each man carried rifles, grenades, ammunition, and other equipment needed to fight independently behind enemy lines. The atmosphere was tense but focused. Some soldiers spoke quietly with the men beside them, while others simply stared at the floor or checked their gear one last time. Later accounts from participants described the strange quietness of those moments before takeoff. There was none of the nervous joking that often preceded combat operations. Instead, there was concentration and a shared understanding that what they were about to attempt had rarely been done before. Shortly before midnight, the aircraft towing the gliders began their takeoff runs along darkened airfields in England. One by one, the gliders lifted into the air behind their tow planes, climbing slowly over the English countryside before turning toward the black waters of the Channel. Below them, the vast Allied invasion fleet was already moving toward France, an armada of ships carrying thousands of soldiers who would soon storm the beaches of Normandy. But while the massive fleet captured most of the attention in the coming hours, the small formation of gliders heading toward the French coast carried one of the most critical missions of the entire operation, known as Operation Overlord. As the aircraft approached the French coastline shortly after midnight, the pilots prepared for the most delicate phase of the flight. At a precise moment, the tow cables would be released, leaving the gliders to descend silently toward their landing zones. Without engines, there would be no second chances. The pilots would have only one opportunity to guide their aircraft to the correct field beside the canal. Then the moment arrived. The cables were released, and the gliders slipped free into the night sky. Instantly, the roar of engines disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the rush of air across the wooden wings. Below them lay the dark countryside of Normandy. Somewhere ahead, barely visible in the night, was the bridge that had to be captured within minutes. The first glider descended rapidly toward the small field beside the canal. The pilot fought to control the aircraft as it dropped toward the ground. The landing zone was narrow, surrounded by obstacles, and there was little room for error. Seconds later, the glider slammed into the field with tremendous force, skidding across the ground and crashing through hedges before finally coming to a stop only a short distance from the bridge itself. The impact threw soldiers forward inside the cabin, but there was no time to recover. The doors burst open, and the soldiers rushed out into the darkness. Their objective stood just ahead of them, Pegasus Bridge. German sentries were stationed nearby, but the sudden arrival of the glider had caught them completely by surprise. Within seconds, the British troops began their assault. Gunfire cracked through the quiet night as teams rushed toward both ends of the bridge. Additional gliders were landing around the area, each delivering more soldiers into the fight. Some crashed violently, while others landed remarkably close to their intended positions. Despite the chaos of the landings, the assault unfolded with remarkable speed. Soldiers moved exactly as they had practiced during their weeks of training in England. Within minutes, the attackers had begun clearing the bridge and surrounding positions. Engineers quickly searched the structure for demolition charges, knowing that the Germans might attempt to destroy it if they realized what was happening. To the relief of the attackers, the preparations for demolition were incomplete. The bridge remained intact. In less than 10 minutes after the first glider had landed, the bridge was in British hands. But the mission was far from over. The soldiers who had captured the bridge now faced the far more difficult task of holding it against any German counterattack until reinforcements arriving from the beaches could reach them. And as the first faint light of dawn began to rise over the fields of Normandy, the men who had arrived silently from the sky prepared themselves for the next phase of the battle that would decide the fate of the invasion. The men who had captured Pegasus Bridge had barely finished securing their immediate surroundings when the reality of their situation settled in. The assault itself had taken only minutes, unfolding with the kind of speed and precision that months of relentless training had been designed to achieve. Yet the success of that lightning strike was only the beginning of the mission. The true test would now begin, holding the bridge against whatever German forces might attempt to reclaim it. The soldiers of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry were deep inside enemy-controlled territory, isolated in the darkness with only the troops who had arrived in the gliders beside them. Until reinforcements could reach them from the coast, they would have to rely on their own discipline, courage, and preparation to maintain control of the crossing that now represented the eastern key to the entire Allied invasion. Major John Howard wasted no time transforming the successful assault into a defensive position. Orders were issued quickly and quietly as soldiers spread out across both ends of the bridge and the nearby roads. Machine guns were positioned to cover the most likely avenues of approach. Small teams moved through nearby houses and structures to ensure that no hidden German troops remained behind them. Others examined the bridge again carefully, making absolutely certain that no demolition charges had been overlooked. Every man understood that if the structure were destroyed, even accidentally, the strategic purpose of their mission would vanish. The bridge had to remain intact, usable, and firmly in Allied hands. The gliders that had delivered the troops now lay scattered across the fields like silent witnesses to the daring attack that had just taken place. Several of the Airspeed Horsa aircraft had crashed violently during landing, their wooden frames splintered against hedgerows and fences. Others had come to rest surprisingly close to the bridge itself, a testament to the extraordinary skill of the pilots who had guided them through darkness and uncertainty. Some of the damaged gliders were quickly turned into makeshift defensive positions. Soldiers dragged ammunition, crates, and equipment into cover, while others watched the surrounding countryside with tense concentration. As the first faint light of dawn began to spread across the Norman fields, the quiet of the early morning started to break. In the distance, occasional gunshots echoed through the countryside. German troops stationed in nearby villages were beginning to realize that something unusual had happened during the night. Patrols were being sent out to investigate strange reports, crashes, gunfire, and unfamiliar aircraft seen descending from the sky. At first, these patrols were small and cautious, unsure of what they might encounter, but they would soon discover that a determined group of British soldiers had taken control of one of the most critical positions in the region. One of the earliest German patrols approached along a narrow road leading toward the canal. The soldiers defending the bridge spotted the movement and waited until the patrol came close enough to confirm its identity. When the German troops advanced within range, British machine guns suddenly opened fire, shattering the early morning quiet. The patrol scattered under the sudden attack, some attempting to retreat while others fired blindly toward the bridge. Within moments, the encounter was over, leaving the British defenders more alert than ever. The enemy now knew that the bridge had been captured. Meanwhile, scattered elements of the 6th Airborne Division were beginning to converge on the area. During the night, hundreds of paratroopers had descended across the region, many landing far from their intended drop zones due to darkness, wind, and anti-aircraft fire. Small groups of these airborne soldiers were now navigating through hedgerows, fields, and villages, attempting to locate their objectives or link up with friendly forces. For several of these groups, the bridge at Benouville became a natural rallying point. One by one, exhausted but determined paratroopers began arriving at the bridge, greeted by the men who had captured it only hours earlier. A diary entry written later by one airborne officer described the powerful sense of relief he felt upon seeing the bridge still standing and firmly in Allied hands. After wandering through unfamiliar terrain for hours, uncertain of the situation around him, the sight of British troops guarding the crossing confirmed that at least part of the complex airborne operation had succeeded exactly as planned. Yet the growing number of Allied soldiers around the bridge also increased the urgency of German response. Reports were now reaching German commanders that enemy airborne troops had landed throughout the region east of Caen, though the information was fragmented and sometimes contradictory. It was clear that a coordinated operation was underway. Orders began moving down the German chain of command to investigate and eliminate these airborne forces before they could consolidate their positions. As morning progressed, additional German units began probing toward the canal. Some came cautiously in small groups, attempting to gather information before committing to a larger attack. Others moved more aggressively, believing they might be confronting only scattered paratroopers rather than a firmly established defensive position. In several of these encounters, the British defenders managed to repel the attacks quickly, using well-placed machine guns and disciplined rifle fire to stop advancing enemy troops before they could reach the bridge. Despite these successes, the men defending the bridge understood that a more serious counterattack could come at any moment. German armored units stationed deeper inland possessed the capability to move quickly once they received clear orders. A column of tanks appearing on the road toward the bridge could dramatically change the balance of the battle. For this reason, British soldiers established lookout positions along nearby roads and fields, watching carefully for the first sign of approaching vehicles. While the tension around the bridge continued to build, another dramatic development was unfolding to the west, along the coast. Thousands of Allied troops were storming ashore at the beaches of Normandy as part of the massive invasion known as D-Day. Among the landing areas was Sword Beach, where British forces were pushing inland toward the canal with the objective of linking up with the airborne troops who had captured the bridges during the night. The distance between the beach and Pegasus Bridge was not great, but German resistance and the chaos of the invasion meant that every kilometer would have to be fought for. Back at the bridge, the defenders continued strengthening their positions. Trenches were dug where possible, and weapons were carefully placed to cover the open ground leading toward the crossing. Ammunition was distributed and casualty positions prepared. Though the soldiers had achieved a remarkable success in capturing the bridge, fatigue was beginning to set in. Many had been awake for long hours before the mission even began, and the adrenaline of the assault was now fading into the steady tension of waiting for the next attack. Then, sometime later in the morning, a new sound began to carry across the fields from the direction of the coast. At first, it was faint, barely distinguishable from the distant rumble of battle still raging near the shoreline. But gradually it became clearer, rhythmic sound, unlike gunfire or engines. It was music. Marching toward the bridge were British commandos advancing inland from Sword Beach, under the leadership of Lord Lovett. At the head of the column walked a man, playing the bagpipes, Bill Millen. Against the backdrop of one of the largest military operations in history, the sound of the pipes drifting across the Norman countryside created an unforgettable moment for the soldiers defending the bridge. As the commandos approached, cheers and waves greeted them from the airborne troops who had held the crossing through the long and uncertain hours since midnight. The arrival of these reinforcements meant that the position was no longer isolated. The fragile foothold established by the glider assault had successfully connected with the advancing invasion force from the sea. When the commandos finally crossed Pegasus Bridge, the daring airborne operation, carried out in the darkness of early morning, had fully achieved its strategic purpose. The bridge remained intact, the eastern flank of the invasion was secured, and the Allied forces now had a vital route through which they could expand their foothold in Normandy. For the men who had arrived silently in gliders only hours earlier, it was the moment when they realized that their extraordinary gamble had succeeded. Their mission, one of the boldest small unit operations of the war, had helped ensure that the invasion of Europe could continue moving forward. And yet, even as relief spread through the exhausted defenders, the larger battle for Normandy was only just beginning. Although the arrival of the commandos brought a wave of relief to the exhausted defenders, the fighting around Pegasus Bridge was far from over. The successful link-up between the airborne troops and the advancing forces from Sword Beach had secured the crossing for the moment. But German forces in the region were beginning to organize a more serious response. Reports had reached several German headquarters that Allied paratroopers and glider troops had landed east of Caen and seized critical positions along the canal and river crossings. For the German command structure, this represented a dangerous development. If those crossings remained in Allied hands, they would prevent German armored units from maneuvering freely toward the beaches, while allowing Allied troops to expand their foothold deeper into Normandy. Throughout the late morning and early afternoon of June 6, 1944, German commanders began attempting to coordinate counterattacks to push the airborne troops away from the canal crossings. Several units in the region, including elements of the experienced 21st Panzer Division, were capable of mounting armored attacks if given clear orders. However, confusion, disrupted communications, and uncertainty about the scale of the invasion slowed their response. The Allied airborne landings had created widespread chaos behind German defensive lines, cutting roads, destroying communication lines, and spreading reports of enemy troops appearing in unexpected places. At Pegasus Bridge, the soldiers who had arrived in the gliders continued strengthening their defenses as the day progressed. The men of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire light infantry worked alongside newly arrived paratroopers and commandos to establish overlapping fields of fire and observation points along the canal banks and surrounding roads. Every approach to the bridge was watched carefully. Machine guns were positioned behind hedgerows and sandbagged positions, while anti-tank weapons were placed where they could cover the main road leading toward the crossing. Major John Howard continued moving among his men, ensuring that every position remained alert and coordinated. Howard understood that even though the bridge had been captured quickly during the night, a determined counterattack supported by armor could still threaten the entire position. His men had already demonstrated remarkable discipline during the assault itself, but now they would need endurance and patience to hold their ground through the long and uncertain hours that followed. Several skirmishes occurred during the day as German patrols and small units attempted to probe the Allied defenses. Some of these clashes were brief, consisting of exchanges of rifle fire across fields or along narrow roads bordered by hedgerows. In other cases, German troops advanced closer, attempting to identify weaknesses in the Allied line. Each time, the defenders of the bridge responded quickly and effectively, forcing the attackers to withdraw before they could threaten the crossing directly. One of the greatest dangers came from the possibility of German armored vehicles approaching the bridge. Tanks possessed the firepower and protection needed to break through lightly equipped airborne troops if they managed to reach effective firing range. British soldiers positioned anti-tank weapons carefully, watching every road that might carry such a threat. In one encounter during the day, an approaching German armored vehicle was engaged by British anti-tank gunners before it could advance close enough to challenge the defenders directly. The successful defense reinforced the growing confidence among the airborne troops that they could hold the bridge despite the dangers surrounding them. Meanwhile, the broader invasion was continuing to unfold across Normandy. Along the coastline, Allied forces were gradually consolidating their positions despite fierce resistance in some sectors. The beaches that had been scenes of intense fighting during the early hours of the morning were slowly transforming into supply corridors as additional troops, vehicles, and equipment poured ashore. The success of those landings was directly connected to the work done by the airborne troops inland. By securing the eastern flank of the invasion zone, the defenders of Pegasus Bridge prevented German units from launching coordinated attacks across the canal that might have threatened the newly established beachhead. Throughout the afternoon, more Allied troops passed through the area around the bridge as the invasion expanded inland. Engineers examined the structure carefully, ensuring that it remained safe for heavy vehicles to cross. Communication lines were established with other Allied units in the region, linking the airborne forces with the broader command structure directing the invasion. What had begun as a daring and isolated assault during the night was gradually becoming part of a larger network of Allied control, spreading through the Normandy countryside. For many of the soldiers who had arrived in the gliders during the first moments of the invasion, the events of the day passed in a strange mixture of exhaustion and alertness. They had already experienced one of the most intense moments of their military careers during the sudden nighttime landing and assault, yet the hours that followed demanded constant vigilance. Even brief moments of rest were interrupted by distant gunfire, the movement of patrols, or reports of enemy activity nearby. Some soldiers later wrote about the surreal atmosphere that developed around the bridge as the day went on. Vehicles began moving across the crossing, Allied troops marched through the area, and supplies were carried toward the front lines forming further inland. At the same time, the wreckage of the gliders still lay scattered across the nearby fields, silent reminders of the dramatic beginning of the battle only hours earlier. As evening approached on June 6, the strategic significance of the operation carried out at Pegasus Bridge had become increasingly clear. The daring glider assault had succeeded not only in capturing the bridge intact but also in preventing German forces from using it to strike the vulnerable eastern flank of the Allied invasion. The small group of airborne soldiers who had arrived silently in the darkness had played a decisive role in securing the success of the first day of the invasion of Normandy. Historians would later describe the capture of Pegasus Bridge as one of the most precise and effective airborne operations of the entire Second World War. The landing of the gliders only meters from the objective, the rapid assault that secured the bridge within minutes, and the determined defense that followed demonstrated an extraordinary level of preparation and discipline. For the men who had taken part in the operation, however, the experience was less about historical recognition and more about survival. teamwork, and the fulfillment of a mission they had trained for relentlessly. In the days and weeks that followed, the battle for Normandy would continue with enormous intensity as Allied forces fought to break out from the beachheads and push deeper into occupied France. Yet the events of that early morning would remain one of the defining moments of the invasion. In the darkness before dawn, a handful of gliders had crossed the skies of Normandy and delivered a force whose courage and precision helped open the path for the liberation of Western Europe. As the afternoon of June 6 continued to unfold across Normandy, the men holding Pegasus Bridge understood that the battle for the crossing might still enter its most dangerous phase, although the initial German responses had been fragmented and cautious. Reports were spreading through the German command structure that Allied airborne forces had seized key positions east of Caen. Among those positions, the bridge over the Caen Canal was quickly recognized as a critical objective. If German forces could retake it, they might still open a route to counterattack the Allied forces that had landed earlier that morning on Sword Beach. German commanders in the region began directing armored elements toward the area in an effort to assess the situation and, if possible, push the airborne troops away from the canal crossings. Among the units capable of responding was the experienced 21st Panzer Division, which maintained armored formations not far from the invasion zone. However, the German response throughout the first day of the invasion was hampered by confusion, damaged communications, and uncertainty about the scale of the Allied operation. Some commanders believed the airborne landings were diversionary actions, while others suspected they were part of a much larger coordinated assault. At the bridge itself, the defenders remained alert. Soldiers from the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, reinforced by paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division and commandos who had advanced inland from the beaches, maintained constant watch along every road leading toward the canal. The surrounding terrain of Normandy fields, bordered by hedgerows, narrow roads, and scattered farmhouses, provided both cover and danger. Enemy troops could potentially approach unseen until they were dangerously close to the defensive line. During the late afternoon, reports began to circulate among the Allied defenders that armored vehicles had been spotted moving somewhere in the region. Observers scanned the distant roads carefully, watching for the telltale silhouette of tanks or armored cars. The possibility of an armored attack had been one of the greatest concerns during the planning of the glider assault. Airborne troops were lightly equipped compared to regular infantry divisions, and while they possessed anti-tank weapons, they lacked the heavy firepower needed to withstand a sustained assault by large armored formations. Eventually, the threat materialized. German armored vehicles began probing the outskirts of the airborne defensive perimeter. These movements did not immediately develop into a massive assault, but they created several tense confrontations as Allied anti-tank teams prepared to engage any vehicle that attempted to approach the bridge itself. One such encounter involved a German armored vehicle advancing cautiously along a road that led toward the canal crossing. British soldiers waited until it moved into a vulnerable position before opening fire with anti-tank weapons. The vehicle was disabled before it could bring its guns to bear on the bridge defenses, forcing accompanying German troops to withdraw. These clashes reinforced the determination of the defenders. Every successful engagement strengthened the sense that the position could be held despite the threats surrounding them. Yet no one at Pegasus Bridge believed the battle was truly finished. The war in Normandy was expanding rapidly, and the canal crossings remained valuable targets for German commanders attempting to slow the Allied advance. Meanwhile, to the north and west, the vast invasion of Normandy continued to grow in scale. Waves of Allied soldiers, vehicles, and equipment were pouring onto the beaches, transforming the shoreline into a massive supply and reinforcement corridor. Engineers were clearing obstacles, medics were treating casualties, and commanders were directing units inland to expand the fragile foothold established that morning. The success of those operations depended heavily on securing the flanks of the invasion zone, and the airborne forces east of the beaches had played a vital role in achieving that objective. The village of Ronville, located just beyond the canal, became another important focal point for the airborne troops. British paratroopers had secured the village earlier during the night, creating a defensive anchor for the eastern side of the canal crossing. Together, the positions at Ronville and Pegasus Bridge formed a protective barrier that prevented German forces from moving easily toward the invasion beaches from that direction. Throughout the evening hours, Allied troops continued consolidating these positions. Defensive lines were strengthened, communication networks expanded, and patrols sent out to monitor German activity. The initial chaos of the airborne landings had gradually evolved into a more organized defensive structure linking the bridge, the nearby villages, and the advancing forces arriving from the coast. For the soldiers who had arrived in gliders during the dark hours before dawn, the transformation of the battlefield was striking. Only hours earlier, they had landed in a silent, hostile landscape, uncertain of what forces might be waiting for them in the darkness. Now the countryside around them was alive with Allied movement columns of soldiers marching along roads, vehicles crossing the canal, and supply units establishing logistical routes that would support the continuing advance into France. Despite this growing Allied presence, the wreckage of the gliders remained scattered across the fields near the bridge, silent reminders of the daring beginning of the operation. Many soldiers paused occasionally to look at those broken wooden aircraft, remembering the violent landing that had delivered them directly into the opening moments of the invasion. As night approached once again on June 6, the strategic success of the operation at Pegasus Bridge had become undeniable. The bridge remained intact and firmly in Allied hands. The eastern flank of the invasion zone was secure, preventing German armored units from launching an immediate counterattack toward the beaches, and the airborne troops who had carried out the operation had successfully linked with the advancing forces from the coast, ensuring that the canal crossing would serve as a gateway for further Allied advances. In the days that followed, the battle for Normandy would continue with extraordinary intensity. Allied forces would fight through hedgerows, villages, and fortified German positions as they attempted to break out from the beachheads and push deeper into occupied France. Yet the events that had taken place in the darkness before dawn on June 6 would remain one of the most remarkable moments of the entire campaign. The capture of Pegasus Bridge demonstrated how a small, highly trained force could achieve a strategic objective with speed, precision, and determination. Within minutes of landing, the airborne troops had seized a bridge that played a critical role in protecting the entire invasion. Their actions ensured that when the massive Allied armada reached the shores of Normandy, its eastern flank would already be guarded by soldiers who had arrived silently from the sky. For historians studying the invasion, the operation remains a powerful example of planning and execution. For the soldiers who fought there, it was simply the mission they had trained for, one that began in darkness, unfolded with sudden violence, and ended with the quiet realization that they had helped open the path for the liberation of Europe. As darkness returned to Normandy on the evening of June 6, the soldiers stationed around Pegasus Bridge finally experienced a brief moment to reflect on the extraordinary events of the previous 24 hours. What had begun as a silent glide through the night sky had transformed into one of the most precise and successful airborne operations of the entire war. The bridge they had seized only minutes after landing now served as a critical artery for Allied movement across the canal, linking the advancing forces from Sword Beach with the airborne troops holding the eastern flank of the invasion zone. The men who had landed in the first wave of gliders were exhausted. Many had not slept for well over a day. They had endured the tension of the flight across the English Channel, the violent impact of the landing, the rapid assault on the bridge, and the long hours of defending their position while waiting for reinforcements to arrive. Yet despite the fatigue, a quiet sense of accomplishment spread among them. The mission that had seemed almost impossibly precise during weeks of training had unfolded almost exactly as planned. For the soldiers of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, the events of that morning would remain unforgettable. Under the leadership of John Howard, they had executed an operation that military historians would later describe as one of the finest examples of a small unit assault during the entire Second World War. The gliders had landed astonishingly close to their objective. The defenders had been overwhelmed in a matter of minutes, and the bridge had been secured before demolition charges could be detonated. Nearby, in the village of Ronville, additional airborne units continued strengthening their positions. Ronville had become one of the first French villages to be liberated during the invasion, and it served as an important anchor point for Allied defenses east of the canal. Paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division established defensive lines around the village, ensuring that German forces could not easily approach the canal crossings from the east. Together, the defenses at Ronville and Pegasus Bridge formed a protective shield guarding the flank of the expanding Allied beachhead. German forces in the region did not abandon their attempts to disrupt the Allied foothold. Throughout the following days, elements of German infantry and armored units launched probing attacks against airborne positions around the canal and nearby villages. Units connected to formations such as the 21st Panzer Division attempted to locate weaknesses in the Allied defensive network. These engagements sometimes developed into intense local battles as German troops attempted to push closer to the canal crossings. However, the situation had changed dramatically since the early hours of June 6. What had initially been a small and isolated group of airborne soldiers defending the bridge had now grown into a much stronger Allied presence. Reinforcements continued arriving from the beaches, and additional artillery and anti-tank weapons were deployed in the area. The defenders who had once feared being overwhelmed now found themselves part of a steadily expanding front line stretching across the Normandy countryside. As the days passed, Pegasus Bridge became more than just a tactical objective, became a symbol of the daring beginning of the invasion. Soldiers moving through the area often paused to look at the damaged gliders still lying in nearby fields. Those wooden aircraft, shattered during their violent landings, represented the extraordinary risk taken by the pilots and troops who had delivered the first blow of the invasion inland. For many of the soldiers who had participated in the assault, the memory of those first moments after landing remained vivid, long after the battle had moved elsewhere. The sudden burst of gunfire in the darkness, the rush across the bridge, and the realization that they had achieved their objective within minutes all became part of a story that would be told and retold for decades. The name Pegasus Bridge itself came from the emblem of the 6th Airborne Division, which featured the mythical winged horse Pegasus. That symbol represented airborne troops descending from the sky, striking quickly and unexpectedly before the enemy could react. In many ways, the operation carried out at the bridge perfectly embodied that idea. The soldiers had quite literally arrived from the sky in silence, seized a vital position, and held it long enough for the larger invasion force to secure its foothold in France. In the weeks that followed, the Allied campaign in Normandy expanded into one of the most intense and complex military operations of the war. The fighting would move through fields, hedgerows, and towns as Allied forces pushed south toward the city of Caen and beyond. Each step forward required enormous effort and sacrifice. Yet the early success of the airborne operations on the eastern flank helped ensure that the invasion would not be pushed back into the sea during its fragile opening stages. Historians, looking back on the events of June 6, 1944, often point to the capture of Pegasus Bridge as a perfect example of how preparation, precision, and courage could combine to achieve results far beyond the size of the force involved. Fewer than 200 soldiers had taken part in the original glider assault, yet their actions had secured a position of enormous strategic importance. Today, the bridge itself remains one of the most famous locations connected to the invasion of Normandy and the broader Battle of Normandy. Visitors who travel to the quiet village of Benouville can still stand near the canal where the gliders landed and imagine the dramatic moments that unfolded there in the darkness before dawn. Museums, memorials, and preserved artifacts now mark the site, honoring the soldiers who carried out one of the boldest missions of the Second World War. But beyond the historical significance and the monuments that commemorate the battle, the true legacy of Pegasus Bridge lies in the courage and determination of the men who were willing to undertake such a mission. In the early hours of June 6, when the outcome of the invasion was still uncertain, they stepped out of shattered gliders and into history, securing a bridge that helped open the road to the liberation of Europe. In the weeks that followed the capture of Pegasus Bridge, the quiet canal crossing that had once seemed like an obscure objective became deeply embedded in the unfolding story of the Allied campaign in France. What had begun as a daring glider assault carried out in darkness was now part of a much larger military effort spreading across the Norman countryside. Allied forces were steadily pushing outward from the beaches, attempting to expand their foothold against a determined German defense. The battle that followed would become known as the Battle of Normandy, a brutal and complex struggle that would last for weeks as both sides fought for control of the region. For the soldiers of the 6th Airborne Division, the days after the initial landings were filled with constant patrols, defensive operations, and skirmishes with German forces attempting to probe the Allied lines. The villages and hedgerow-lined fields around the canal became a patchwork of fortified positions as British paratroopers and infantry worked to hold the territory they had seized. The village of Ronville remained a critical defensive anchor east of the canal, while Pegasus Bridge itself continued to serve as a vital crossing point for troops, vehicles, and supplies moving inland from Sword Beach. German commanders recognized the importance of these positions and continued searching for opportunities to disrupt Allied control. Elements connected to formations such as the 21st Panzer Division occasionally launched probing attacks or artillery bombardments aimed at testing the strength of the airborne defenses. These engagements often occurred suddenly, erupting in bursts of gunfire across fields and village streets before fading again into uneasy quiet. For the men who had participated in the original glider assault, the battlefield around Pegasus Bridge became both familiar and surreal. Many of the damaged airspeed Horsa aircraft still lay scattered in nearby fields, their wooden frames broken and partially buried in the earth. These wrecked gliders served as a constant reminder of the dramatic moment when the airborne troops had first arrived. Soldiers passing by them sometimes paused briefly, recalling the violent landing and the rush toward the bridge that had followed. The soldiers themselves gradually became aware that their mission had already achieved a level of recognition among other Allied units. Troops arriving from the beaches often asked about the glider assault and the rapid capture of the bridge. The story spread quickly through the Allied ranks. A small group of airborne soldiers had landed almost directly on top of their objective and seized it within minutes. In the vast scale of the Normandy invasion, it was a remarkably precise operation. Major John Howard and the men under his command remained focused on their duties rather than on any growing reputation. The war in Normandy was far from finished, and the Airborne Division still faced dangerous responsibilities as the front line shifted south. Toward the city of Caen, patrols continued moving out from Pegasus Bridge and nearby positions, gathering intelligence and maintaining pressure on German forces attempting to reorganize. The terrain of Normandy made every movement difficult. The region's dense, hedgerow-thick earthen embankments topped with tangled vegetation created natural defensive barriers that could hide enemy positions until soldiers were almost upon them. Fighting in this landscape often took place at extremely close range, with small units maneuvering cautiously through narrow gaps in the hedgerows or along winding country lanes. Despite these challenges, Allied forces slowly expanded their control of the region. The presence of secure canal crossings east of the beachhead helped ensure that the flank of the invasion remained protected as larger formations pushed deeper inland. What had once been an isolated airborne outpost had become part of a growing network of roads and supply routes supporting the Allied advance. As time passed, the story of the glider landing at Pegasus Bridge began to take on an almost legendary quality among the troops who fought in Normandy. The idea of landing a glider within meters of an enemy-held bridge in complete darkness sounded almost unbelievable to those who had not witnessed it themselves. Yet for the soldiers who had lived through it, the memory remained vivid and very real. In later years, historians studying the invasion would often point to the operation as one of the most successful examples of precision airborne warfare during the Second World War. The careful planning, the skill of the glider pilots, and the discipline of the assault troops had combined to achieve a strategic objective with astonishing speed. Within minutes of landing, the attackers had secured a bridge that helped protect the entire eastern flank of the invasion. Today, the site of Pegasus Bridge stands as one of the most significant locations connected to the Allied landings in Normandy. Visitors traveling through the region can still see the canal, the surrounding fields, and the village streets where those events unfolded. Memorials and museums near the bridge preserve artifacts from the battle, including pieces of the gliders and equipment used by the airborne troops. These exhibits serve as reminders of the courage and determination shown by the soldiers who carried out the mission. For many veterans of the operation, the memories of that early morning in June remained among the most powerful experiences of their lives. The tension of the silent flight across the channel, the sudden crash landing in the fields of Normandy, the brief but violent assault on the bridge, and the long hours spent defending it while waiting for reinforcements. All of these moments formed a story that would be remembered long after the war had ended. The capture of Pegasus Bridge did not by itself win the war in Europe, but it played an important role in ensuring that the invasion of Normandy could succeed. By securing the canal crossing before German forces could destroy or defend it, the airborne troops helped create the conditions necessary for the Allied armies to establish themselves on French soil. From that foothold, the liberation of Western Europe would slowly begin, and so, in the quiet fields beside the canal near Benouville, the events of a single night became part of a much larger turning point in history. A handful of gliders descending silently from the darkness had delivered soldiers who would hold a bridge that helped open the road toward the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. After the successful capture of the bridge during the early hours of June 6, 1944, the soldiers of the 6th Airborne Division quickly transitioned from a rapid assault mission to a far more difficult task, holding the position while the Normandy invasion expanded around them. Throughout the rest of D-Day, British troops advancing inland from Sword Beach eventually linked up with the airborne soldiers defending the bridge. This connection was critical because it secured the eastern flank of the Allied invasion, preventing German armored units from moving quickly toward the beaches where thousands of Allied troops were landing. In the days that followed, fighting intensified in the countryside surrounding the bridge and the nearby village of Ronville. German forces attempted several counterattacks in the region. Elements connected to formations such as the 21st Panzer Division tried to probe Allied defenses and, if possible, push back toward the canal crossings. However, the situation had changed dramatically since the early hours of D-Day. What had originally been a small group of airborne troops holding the bridge had now become part of a growing Allied defensive network. Reinforcements, artillery, and anti-tank weapons were brought into the area, making it far more difficult for German forces to retake the position. Meanwhile, the larger campaign known as the Battle of Normandy continued to expand. Allied armies fought their way through the difficult terrain of hedgerows, villages, and defensive German positions as they pushed deeper into France. The successful capture of Pegasus Bridge helped ensure that the eastern flank of the invasion remained secure during these critical early days. Over time, the operation became recognized as one of the most precise airborne assaults of the war. Fewer than 200 soldiers, transported in silent gliders, had landed almost directly on top of their objective and captured a strategically vital bridge within minutes. Today, Pegasus Bridge remains one of the most famous locations associated with the D-Day landings. The area around Benouville now contains museums and memorials dedicated to the soldiers who carried out the daring glider assault. Their mission demonstrated how a small, highly trained force could achieve a strategic victory that helped shape the success of the Allied invasion of Normandy and ultimately contributed to the liberation of Western Europe.